Welcome back, environmental ethics folks. I hope you've had a good break. I'm sure with the COVID-19 pandemic that it's been stressful, but I also hope that you've had some good times on top of that stress. So because we have been apart from each other for as long as we have, I want to start by reminding you where we've been. Because so far in Phil 330, we've covered almost 4,000 years of environmental thought in just a short time, going all the way back to some Vedic texts up to Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. So to remember where we've been this semester, we started off with the fact that the modern Western world has had an almost exclusively problematic relationship to the environment. So instead of taking a really traditional environmental ethics proper approach, we decided to start the semester with a detour through some environmental moral psychology. And to remind you of what that means, remember when we traditionally think of environmental ethics, we're looking at the study of how humans should and should not interact with their environments, and how environmental considerations impact investigation into what we should and shouldn't do more generally. So, one particular question in this realm might be something like, is it permissible for humans to kill non-human animals for the sake of eating them? There, we're taking general ethical concepts concerning permissibility and obligation, and we're applying those to a particular case involving the environment. Another way we can look at things, though, is by taking a look at moral psychology in relation to environmental issues, where moral psychology studies human thought and behavior in these ethical contexts where environmental ethical questions might come up. So an environmental moral psychology question might be something like, what makes people think the way they do about eating non-human animals? That is, how do humans think and behave when the earlier question becomes relevant? So we wanted to take a look at a history of environmental moral psychology because it seems that today we have some clearly problematic thinking and actions in relation to the environment. So we wanted to take a look at the history of environmental thinking in relation to ethical behavior with the environment to see if we could find some more promising avenues. And we took the suggestion from Lynn White Jr. that something about people's conception of the relationship between humanity, nature, and the divine has something to do with how we treat the environment. So we did a history of environmental moral psychology that looked at these issues, including discussion of ancient Hinduism and this notion of eco-spirituality, ancient Confucianism and Taoism, which we found correlative thinking in both of those, but remembering Karen Lai's comment that when we look at ancient Chinese thought, a lot of times we find deeper differences underlying some superficial similarities. We found that this correlative thinking in ancient Confucianism was anthropocentric, whereas this correlative thinking in ancient Taoism was non-anthropocentric. From there, we took a look at some ancient Greek thought, both ancient pre-Socratic thought, where we found many similar ideas to the ones mentioned above, but also ancient Socratic thought, where moral intellectualism and the epistemology that went into moral intellectualism seemed to have some consequences for thinking about the environment. From there, we moved into the medieval period, focusing on the medieval Americas first, where we looked at some Incan thought on this notion of holism. We looked at some medieval Nahua thought with this focus on teotl, which led us to a discussion of pantheism and the notion of balance and moderation in relation to the environment. We also looked at the medieval period in the Islamic Golden Age, where this focus on cosmic responsibility that humans have to the rest of the natural world was central. And finally, we briefly discussed the modern period, things like scientific materialism, mechanism, all the way up to Aldo Leopold's land ethic. As we finished up this general discussion of environmental moral psychology, we're now moving into environmental ethical questions proper. And we start here with some ethical questions about how we ought to use pesticides, insecticides, and herbicides. And this really has us needing to start at Rachel Carson's 1962 book, Silent Spring. This is the book which really set the contemporary environmental movement in motion, so we want to spend some time talking about it. In particular, we want to focus on the first 3 chapters of Carson's Silent Spring. Chapter 1, A Fable for Tomorrow, really sets up why Carson is writing the book in the first place. She sees the way that we are using these insecticides, pesticides, and herbicides as setting us on a grim path toward the future. So here, she really sets up a little narrative of what she thinks that future will be like in a way which she hopes will concern us. A particularly notable passage here is that it was a spring without voices. On the mornings that had once throbbed with the dawn chorus of robins, catbirds, doves, jays, wrens, and scores of other bird voices, there was now no sound. Only silence lay over the fields and woods and marsh. And this idea of getting us to think about tomorrow, this idea of getting us to look in the future, is one of the things we find throughout Carson's work. She really thinks that the use of synthetic pesticides is a sign of our being very, very short-sighted. And we see this in the title for Chapter 2, The Obligation to Endure. Again, I've included here a passage which I think really gets at what Carson was trying to do in Chapter 2 here. And she says, "How could intelligent beings seek to control a few unwanted species by a method that contaminated the entire environment and brought the threat of disease and death even to their own kind?" And finally, in Chapter 3, which she calls Elixirs of Death, she doesn't just want us to take her at her word, saying that we are trying to control a few unwanted species in these problematic ways. She wants us to understand precisely why she makes that claim. So, in a telling passage from Chapter 3, Elixirs of Death, Carson says, "If we're going to live so intimately with these chemicals, eating and drinking them, taking them into the very marrow of our bones, we had better know something about their nature and their power." And this is what Carson does in Chapter 3. Again, one of the things I'm most interested in Carson's work is what made it so she was able to be so influential, so effective. And I think one of those things comes from the fact that she reframes and reconceptualizes things for people in really interesting ways. In ways where something which seemed so familiar to us in the past and seemed so innocuous, all of a sudden starts to have a really different spin to it. And this is some of what I think she does best in Chapter 2. So let's take a look at some of those arguments. In Chapter 2, Carson wants us to rethink the way we talk about insecticides, pesticides, and herbicides. And she starts from the fact that products should be named according to what they actually do, what they actually accomplish, rather than what we say they're for or what we intended their use for. And she thinks this is relevant because DDT and these other pesticides she's talking about, she says they have the actual consequences of biocides, despite their intent to be pesticides, insecticides, and herbicides. That is, despite the fact that we intend these to just go after certain pest species, certain insect species, and certain herb species, certain plant species, she thinks they have actual consequences where they devastatingly impact all life. And because of that, she gets to the conclusion that these products she's discussing should be called biocides rather than pesticides, insecticides, and herbicides, because when we're discussing these issues, we need to be discussing them in terms of what actually happens. And if we recognize that these things are actually biocides, Carson thinks this will make us seriously rethink how we use them. And her general argument here seems to stem from a consequentialist point of view. That is, she thinks we need to go through a cost-benefit analysis of the ultimate positive and negative consequences that come out of using biocides in the way that they had been. And in particular, she thinks this is important for us to reconsider because she thinks when we do this cost-benefit analysis, we'll see that indiscriminate use of biocides creates more negative than positive consequences. And as a result, we should ultimately decide that we should not be using these biocides indiscriminately. Now, obviously, the primary premise there that needs to be discussed more is premise 2. That is, she needs to give some details on cancer, liver damage, seizures, sterility, pesticide poisoning, and resistance to these pesticides resulting from their indiscriminate use. It's this very task which occupies much of Carson's work in the rest of Silent Spring. But importantly, it's not just the details here that are really important. Carson also sets the stage for a lot of the concepts, a lot of the terms that become very used in circles these days where folks are concerned about the environment. So, in particular, the discussions that Carson has in Silent Spring give people the concepts that ultimately lead to significant discussion these days about the Anthropocene, about biodiversity, about bioaccumulation, about biomagnification. For folks who are interested in the environment these days, these are terms you hear very regularly, and it's important to note that the setup for these being used more generally today, I think really starts with Carson's work here in Silent Spring. But remember, we also want to look at the details that Carson goes into with the science behind premise 2 here, where she talks about the problematic consequences that will arise from indiscriminate use of these different biocides. So again, in Chapter 3, Carson takes on these elixirs of death, these substances she calls biocides, and runs through a number of their chemical properties, in particular as they are relevant for understanding their effects on the health of the land, the health of non-human animals, and the health of humans. Again, I believe this is one of the facets of Carson's work which allowed her to be so effective. She didn't simply assert premise 2 from the previous slide, that these biocides have these greatly negative consequences, such that indiscriminate use of them is going to have greatly more negative than positive consequences. She also didn't say this and tell her readers to go look at these scientific studies yourself. She recognized that the general public often does not have access to such things or has not been given sufficient education to be able to understand such studies. So she gives some of these scientific details in a way that's accessible to the general public. In particular, she gives details on 10 or so different biocides. The details of each of these are not so important for our purposes as the general structure she gives the discussion. In particular, Carson begins by distinguishing between organic biocides, those built around the carbon atom, and inorganic biocides by giving an example of the latter of arsenic and pointing out its toxicity, but focusing much more directly on the organic biocides. Here she discusses two large classes, the chlorinated hydrocarbons and the organic phosphates. The chlorinated hydrocarbons are best represented by DDT, the most well-known of these biocides, but Carson discusses half a dozen others which are listed here in terms of increasing toxicity from left to right. She spends less time on the organic phosphates, discussing just two, parathion and malathion, and here one of the important things to recognize is that each of these classes has their own relative problems. In particular, the chlorinated hydrocarbons persist in the environment for long stretches of time, longer than the organic phosphates, but the organic phosphates are more potentially poisonous through their having much greater synergistic effects with other chemicals. So there's obviously a great deal more we could talk about here, but this sets the stage for our discussion, And if you've been paying attention to my other videos, you've noticed that at the end I'm giving music suggestions here that connect to the particular thing I've been discussing that day. And this is going to be no different. If you've been paying even more attention, though, you've noticed that the last few days I've been focusing on Mr. Liff. Today, I'm going to mix things up a little bit, and we're going to go back to Mos Def.
Cause while these knuckleheads inside get sweating they guts, sun is sitting in the treetops, burning the woods. And if the flame from the blaze get higher and higher, they say, don't drink the water, we need it for the fire. New York is drinking it, the whole of California is drinking it, where you're moving down south is drinking it. Used to have minerals and zinc in it, now they say it got lead and stinking it. Fluoride and monoxide, push the water table lopside. Used to be free, now of course you will feed, cause all things spilling low as they roll across the sea. Man, you gotta cook with it, baby, clean with it. Right. When it's hot summertime, you fiend for it. No. You gotta put it in the iron, you steaming with. Right. It's what they dress wounds and treat diseases with. The rich and poor, black and white got need for it. Right. And everybody in the world can agree with that. Consumption promotes health and easiness. Go too long without it on this earth and you leaving it. Americans wasting it on some leisure shit. Another nation be desperately seeking it. Bacteria washing up on their beaches. Don't drink the water so they can't wash their feet with it. Young babies in perpetual needy days. Epidemics hopping up the petri dish. Control centers trying to play on secret.